My name's Jennifer Schooling and I'm the Director of the Cambridge Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction. This talk is about the climate emergency and construction's role and responsibility in reducing carbon emissions, and in particular a carbon reduction code that we've been developing with an industry group on behalf of the Construction Leadership Council. So what about carbon emissions? Well, the UK government has a target of net zero by 2050, which was introduced by Prime Minister Theresa May. And what's become clear in recent years is that a linear reduction to net zero by 2050 is not going to be fast enough to avoid 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. Current emissions are really exceeding our carbon budget. The other problem with this is that carbon dioxide persists in the atmosphere for 100 to 200 years, and it has a radiative forcing effect. So every tonne of carbon that we emit now will continue to heat the planet every year for the next 100 to 200 years. So we need to save as much carbon as possible, as early as possible. Every tonne of carbon we save now is a tonne of carbon that's not up in our atmosphere for the next 2 centuries. In 2026, which is only 5 years away as I speak, we'll be 20% of the way to the year 2050 from the year 2019, when Theresa May made the zero carbon commitment. So we'll need to make most of our carbon reductions with existing technologies. And according to the Pareto principle, we'll need to reach an 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2026 in order to reach net zero by 2050. What I mean by that is the Pareto principle says that you make 80% of the progress in 20% of the time or with 20% of the effort, and the last 20% takes 80% of the time and effort. So we really need to have a hope of getting to net zero by 2050. We need to aim to have reduced our emissions by 80% by 2026 if we possibly can. And this implies reductions of 20% per year, year on year. That sounds pretty frightening, but the good news is that there are things that we can do about this. We can take different approaches in deciding what we need to build, and indeed deciding whether we need to build at all. One of the things we can start to think about is do we need new buildings or new infrastructure, or can we repurpose something that we already have? Can we use what we already have more efficiently? Can we repair what we already have and keep it in commission? The next question is, do we need to build as much, and do we need to use as much material? Actually, could we, rather than building, a 6-lane highway, could we build a dual carriageway, for example? Is an example of the kind of choices that we need to make. And then the next 2 steps are to build clever, so use materials with lower capital carbon, and to build more efficiently, so use fewer materials and reduce waste. Can we optimize our design? Can we reduce construction waste and have a more efficient construction process? We also need to take a whole life perspective, because our assets are typically used for a very long time in the built environment. There are a number of bridges on our rail network, for example, that were built 150 years ago and are still in use. So how long an asset will be used for is an important factor in considering whether it's worth embodying carbon into the asset, so incorporating more material into the asset to either make it have a longer life or make it operate more efficiently. Perhaps you might have thicker walls on a building. However, if we get that calculation wrong, then what we're doing is emitting carbon now, which perhaps isn't going to have the beneficial effect we were anticipating. So, for example, a lot of commercial buildings are built with a lifetime of 60 years, but often get taken down after 20 to 30 years. So we need to be careful about the life cycle that we're assuming for our infrastructures. We also need to think about how we can make the energy use of our infrastructures more efficient, because even though we're transitioning the economy to zero carbon energy sources, there's actually a limited amount of energy that we can extract from zero carbon sources. So we need to be more efficient with our use of energy. And we also need to make our assets easier to maintain over their lifetime, so that we can keep them in operation for longer and get the most use out of any embodied carbon that we're investing at the moment. It's very important to think about how we measure our progress against this. As Lord Kelvin said back in 1883, if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. And various people have used different versions of that phrase since. We need to learn from real performance. And the diagram on the right-hand side of the slide here shows the way that CSIC kind of carved this up. When we think about the life cycle of an asset as being divided up into how we design our assets, how we build them, how we manage and operate them through their lives, and then also how our infrastructure assets serve our cities. So it's important that we calculate and optimise carbon in the design process, and that we calibrate the design models against the real performance of assets once they're built. We need to control processes on construction sites to reduce waste and reduce fuel use. We need to use the standards that are available to help us do this, for example, PAS 2080 in the infrastructure sector. We need to really monitor and manage waste in construction and collect data about that waste. We need to assess and declare the actual embodied carbon in our assets, including not just the material that was in the design, but also any materials that we use in the process of constructing the asset. For example, we have a lot of temporary works in major projects. And then we need to measure, monitor and reduce our carbon fuel use, both during the construction process and during the life of the asset, and invest in innovation to improve all of these things, and then measure again. Without data, we can't know whether we're making good progress or not. And this brings me on to our carbon reduction code, which was drafted over the course of 2020 by the CSIC Achieving Net Zero Cross-Industry Working Group. And it aims to be a first step to facilitate action by the relevant parties towards reducing carbon emissions. It's not intended to replace standards like PAS 2080, which talk about carbon management on site and so forth. It's intended to sort of set out a contract in a way between the different organisations to collaborate in reducing carbon, and it's intended to point towards relevant standards that can be used to do that. The Carbon Reduction Code comes in 3 sections. The first piece is aimed at all organisations who might be interested in signing up to it and participating in it. And then there's a section for clients and a section for the supply chain. I'm going to talk through all 3 sections. So this first section is for all organisations who are part of the construction, infrastructure and buildings industries. And it states that we'll aim to reduce our direct and indirect carbon emissions by 75% by 2025, which comes out as, on average, 20% per year compound. And we need to do this in order to meet zero carbon emissions by 2045, which is the Scottish Government target, or any other future date if that target date comes forward. So as well as aiming to reduce our carbon emissions, the organisations are saying that they will set out their plans to meet net zero by 2045, including annual targets to do that, and recognising in that the majority of cuts need to be made by 2030, and that will publish our plans and our progress against our plans annually. And that's really important, because that's about actually taking on board this need to measure actual carbon emissions and measure progress in reducing them. And then we come on to the client section of the code, and this includes some core commitments and then some further commitments and opportunities. So the core commitments are for the clients are to include carbon reduction targets and reporting commitments explicitly in procurement documents from 2021 or as early as possible, and have that as a deliverable of the procurement process to move the cost carbon balance in favour of low carbon choices rather than low cost choices. This will include capital carbon as well as whole life carbon. Clients also commit to providing a carbon baseline for each of their projects and setting targets for carbon reduction against these in order to drive innovation, and to commit to having carbon data externally verified as part of the reporting requirements using an appropriate standard such as CMARS in compliance with ISO 14064 Part 1. There's then a range of further commitments that clients can make to help progress the journey and work in collaboration together. So the first of these is to explore and adopt approaches to improve our ability to evaluate lower carbon options and to measure and reduce carbon emissions during the life of existing assets as well as during decommissioning. So a lot of clients have existing asset bases which also need to be decarbonised as well as their new assets. Clients are committing to endeavour to align capital and operational investment plans with the national net zero carbon obligation, and also to provide the supply chain with outcome-based specifications and commercial arrangements, again to incentivise and encourage thinking around low carbon innovations. And there are some other further commitments for clients to work together to share best practice around methodologies, because we're really only going to get there if at the pace we need to if we work together, and by 2025 to have in place an infrastructure carbon data set to be used by the sector. Where possible, this will be done through a national carbon integrator, which the government may choose to instigate, but if not, then the industry will work together to generate one. The clients will also work on a common understanding of ecosystem services, so to take an approach to using ecosystem services both as part of the delivery of infrastructure services, so perhaps looking at the sort of the softer ecosystem options rather than hard concrete options for providing infrastructure services, particularly around things like flood resilience, and to share decarbonisation roadmaps for both new and existing assets. So that's the client commitments. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the supply chain commitments. So again, with the supply chain, in addition to those first 2 points I mentioned earlier, the supply chain commits to reporting on operational carbon, scope 1, 2, and where possible, scope 3, publicly from 2021, or the soonest date possible, to reduce the carbon intensity of projects year on year to achieve the long-term targets set out in the first point of the code. The supply chain is also going to commit to automating the production and delivery of carbon emissions information. One of the challenges we have at the moment is a lot of that data is sort of manually produced, whereas if we can automate the production of the data, then it makes it much easier to monitor what's going on and to monitor our progress in the race towards net zero. The supply chain will proactively recommend and adopt carbon measurement and carbon reduction methodologies on all projects, whether or not the client asks for them. And the supply chain will work in close collaboration with their clients and with their supply chain partners to deliver on client carbon requirements. And this is in part about the sort of tier 1 and tier 2 contractors and consultants helping the smaller organisations in the supply chain to address decarbonisation challenges, because small organisations don't always have the resources to commit to developing solutions. And then the further commitments for the supply chain are for consultants to work with clients to consider the carbon hierarchy options before new build is committed to. So I talked earlier about the choice between no build, build less, build smarter, and build more efficiently, and to integrate nature-based solutions in the design, development, and delivery of projects. The whole supply chain will commit to sharing best practice across the supply chain and learning from and adopting others' best practice where possible. Again, you know, collaboration is really the only way that we're going to get to the carbon reductions we need at the pace we need to do it. Contractors will proactively support the supply chain to adopt carbon measurement and carbon reduction, and will require them to report on carbon, but help them to do so. And the supply chain at large will contribute carbon reduction data to a publicly available carbon measurement database. That's the database I was referring to earlier. So that's the code as it currently stands. The next steps with the code, it's currently being trialled by 3 client organisations, including the National Association of Construction Frameworks and also the Environment Agency and HS2. They are looking at the code in order to assess its practicality for implementation, and we're going to both revise the code based on these learnings, and also we hope to provide some case study examples as to how different organisations have approached adopting the code and helping their supply chain partners to do so. We're working with the Construction Leadership Council, and we are currently planning a soft launch in the middle of 2021, sort of June, July time, with a formal launch in November, hopefully around COP26. And if you'd like to see the current version of the code, you can see that at the bit.ly address CO2DE, as shown on the slide there. Thank you very much for your attention.